Alarms do not usually wake me. I have served on salvage ships long enough that the sound of a hull breach warning has become as ordinary as rain. But the alarm that woke me that night was not the usual kind. It was the kind reserved for one thing only: a live cargo alert. And those are rare enough that most crews go their whole careers without hearing one. I am Kesthar, and at the time I worked as a logistics officer on a void exchange collection vessel. Our job was simple. We followed old slaver trade routes, picked up abandoned ships, cataloged whatever was left inside them, and reported it to the nearest station. Most of what we found was junk. Broken machines, spoiled food, sometimes bones. That night, we found something that would not stay quiet, no matter how many treaties tried to bury it. The ship we intercepted was a rust-colored transport, the kind slavers use when they want a vessel nobody will ask questions about. It had been drifting for 6 days, engines dead, life support failing. When our scanners picked up a single heat signature deep in the cargo hold, I assumed it was a rat, or a broken heater throwing false readings. I was wrong on both counts. We boarded in the usual formation, 3 of us in environmental suits, weapons holstered but ready. The corridors were narrow and cold, lit only by our helmet lamps. The deeper we went, the more the air smelled of fear, an old, stale kind of fear that soaks into metal and never leaves. I have smelled that kind of fear before. It usually means something dangerous is close. We found the cargo hold at the end of a long corridor, sealed with a manual lock that had been welded shut from the outside. That detail alone told me everything I needed to know. Someone had wanted whatever was inside to stay inside, permanently. My commanding officer ordered the door cut open, and when the metal finally gave way, the smell that rushed out made 2 of my crewmates step back without thinking. Inside, curled against the far wall, was a young Threxil. I want to explain what that word means to those who have never traveled beyond the calm, orderly parts of the galaxy. The Threxil are a species every civilized world fears, and not without reason. Fully grown, they stand taller than most other beings, built with claws that can tear through reinforced armor and senses sharp enough to track a heartbeat through solid walls. But it is not their strength that frightens people. It is their history. Threxil raised outside their birth pack are documented, again and again, across 1,000 years of records, to become unstable, violent, unpredictable in ways that cannot be managed or reasoned with. Because of this, an old law called the Cull Accord requires that any Threxil cub found without its pack be humanely destroyed before it matures. Not out of cruelty, the lawmakers always insist, but out of necessity, a kindness to prevent a greater harm. The cub in front of us was perhaps 4 years old in Threxil terms, still small enough to fit inside a supply crate, though its claws and teeth were already long enough to open one. Its fur, or what should have been fur, was patchy and dull, the mark of poor nutrition and worse treatment. It did not move when we entered. It only watched us, eyes reflecting our helmet lights back like small green coins, and I understood immediately why the slavers had welded the door shut and abandoned the ship rather than come back for their cargo. They were more afraid of what was inside that room than of losing their profit. My commanding officer, a broad-shouldered officer named Doran Vale, radioed the station immediately to report a live Threxil cub and to request Cull Accord protocol. This was standard. This was expected. In 11 years of service, I had never once seen anyone question it. The moment a Threxil cub was found separated from its pack, the correct and legal response was immediate termination, carried out as quickly and painlessly as possible. It was not up for discussion. It was law. We were still awaiting station confirmation when the second ship arrived. It came in fast, faster than any void exchange vessel, cutting through the debris field with a precision that told me its pilot was either reckless or extremely skilled. When it docked beside the slaver transport, I expected station enforcement, or perhaps an independent salvage crew hoping to claim a share of our find. What I did not expect was a human vessel, registry markings worn and unfamiliar, requesting permission to board under a claim of civilian rescue rights. I had encountered humans before, of course. They were still new to wider galactic trade at that point, barely a generation past their first contact treaties, and most species treated them the way you treat an eager but unpredictable neighbor. Capable, certainly, resourceful, without question, but naive about the older dangers of the galaxy, the dangers species like mine had learned to fear through centuries of hard lessons. The human who came aboard did not look naive to me. He moved like someone who had done this before, calm in a way that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with simple, practical focus. He introduced himself as Dane, gave no rank, no ship name beyond a call sign, and asked only one question before stepping past me toward the cargo hold. "Is it alive?" I told him yes, and I told him what it was, expecting the warning alone to stop him. Instead, he nodded, thanked me, and kept walking. I followed him, partly out of duty and partly because I could not believe what I was seeing. Doran followed as well, already reciting the Cull Accord regulations, explaining in careful, official language that the cub had been correctly identified, that termination protocol had already been requested, that any interference would be a violation of interspecies law. Dane listened to all of it without slowing his pace. When we reached the cargo hold, the cub had pressed itself further into the corner, quills along its spine rising in a defensive display I recognized from old training footage. It was preparing to fight, or to die fighting, because in its short life, it had learned that every creature who found it wanted one of those two things from it. Dane crouched down at the doorway, not rushing forward, not reaching out, just crouching, making himself smaller, at roughly the same height as the cub's eyes. Doran told him, quite firmly, that this was an official termination scene, and that unauthorized humans needed to withdraw immediately. Dane did not argue. He simply asked a question that none of us had an answer prepared for. Termination scheduled by whom, under whose direct order, and has that order been reviewed by a neutral judiciary body, or only by species precedent? Doran started to answer, then stopped, because the honest answer was that no judiciary body reviewed these cases individually. The law assumed the outcome before the case was ever opened. Cull Accord terminations were treated as a formality, not a decision. Dane used that gap in procedure exactly the way a person uses a crack in a locked door. He requested, under a clause buried deep in interspecies salvage law, a 48-hour custody transfer, for the purpose of independent evaluation, a right, technically available to any registered rescue vessel that reached a live cargo find before termination was carried out. It was a rule almost nobody used, because almost nobody wanted to spend 48 hours in close quarters with an unstable Threxil cub. Doran argued. He warned Dane about the danger, about the weight of history behind the law, about every documented case of a Threxil raised without its pack turning eventually feral, violent, beyond reasoning. Dane listened to every word of it, and then said something I have never forgotten, because it was the first time I heard a human explain, without anger, without fear, exactly how they saw the galaxy differently than the rest of us. "Every case you are describing started the same way," Dane said. "Alone, terrified, and treated like a threat before it ever did anything threatening. I am not saying your law is wrong to be careful. I am asking for 48 hours to find out if it has to end the same way every single time." Doran could not refuse a legally valid request, even one he clearly despised. He signed the transfer under protest, made sure it was logged as such, and warned Dane that if anything went wrong, the responsibility would fall entirely on him and his crew. Dane accepted that without hesitation, as if the weight of it did not bother him at all. What happened next surprised me more than anything else that night. Dane did not order the cub sedated for transport, which was standard procedure even among rescue-minded crews. He did not use a containment collar, or a restraint net, or any of the tools I had seen used 100 times before, with far less dangerous cargo. He simply opened a small case of ration packs, set 2 of them on the floor just inside the doorway, well within reach of the cub, but well outside his own reach, and stepped back. Then he sat down in the corridor, outside the cargo hold, and waited. I asked him, because I genuinely wanted to understand, why he was not concerned about his own safety. He looked at me for a moment before answering, and his answer was simple enough that it has stayed with me ever since. "Fear is contagious," he said. "If I walk in there afraid, it will only confirm to that animal that fear is the correct response to every living thing it meets. I would rather be wrong about my safety than be right about its future." We waited nearly 3 hours. I stood at a respectful distance, recording everything, partly for the official report, and partly because some instinct told me this moment mattered beyond the paperwork it would generate. The cub did not move for the first hour. It watched Dane with the same intense, unreadable focus it had shown all of us, and I fully expected the standoff to end the way every Threxil encounter I had studied ended, in violence or in retreat. In the second hour, the cub inched toward the ration packs, still watching Dane the entire time, muscles coiled and ready to retreat at the first sign of danger. Dane did not move. He did not speak unnecessarily. He simply stayed present, still and unthreatening, the way you might sit quietly near a wild animal you hoped, rather than expected, to earn the trust of. By the third hour, the cub had eaten both ration packs, and for the first time since we had found it, its spine quills had lowered completely. I do not know exactly what that moment meant to Dane. I only know what it meant to me, watching from a distance with 11 years of training, telling me this should not be possible. Every record I had ever studied insisted that an unbonded Threxil could not be approached without extreme danger, could not be calmed without extensive restraint, could not be trusted under any circumstance until proven otherwise, through years of controlled observation. And yet here was a single human, unarmed, unafraid, undoing generations of certainty in the space of one evening. Doran filed his report exactly as he had warned he would, noting his formal objection to the transfer, and predicting, in careful bureaucratic language, that this decision would end badly for everyone involved. I filed my own report as well, though mine was less certain in its conclusions. I had seen something that night that did not match anything in our training, and I did not yet know what to make of it. What I did know, standing in that cold corridor watching a human sit quietly beside a creature every other species in the galaxy would have already destroyed, was that something had changed. Not the law, not yet, but something underneath the law, some old and comfortable certainty that had just been quietly, carefully questioned by someone who did not seem to care how many centuries of precedent stood against him. Before we left the ship, Dane named the cub. He did it simply, almost as an afterthought, crouched at the edge of the cargo hold with the last ration pack held loosely in one hand. He called it Ash, for reasons he never explained to me, and the cub, still wary, still coiled with old fear, did not pull away when he finally, carefully, extended that hand. I watched the transport doors close behind them as Dane carried Ash, wrapped now in a simple thermal blanket rather than any restraint, back toward his ship. Doran stood beside me, arms crossed, shaking his head slowly. 48 hours, he muttered. Then it goes back to protocol, one way or another. I did not answer him. I was still watching the human ship as it detached from the wreckage and turned slowly toward open space, carrying with it a creature the entire galaxy had already decided could never be anything but a monster. I did not know, standing there, that this single choice, made in the space of one quiet evening, by a man who refused to be afraid, would eventually be spoken of on 100 worlds, in tones ranging from disbelief to outrage, to something that, much later, would start to sound very much like hope. I only knew that something had begun that night which could not simply be undone, and somewhere in the back of my mind, beneath the training and the regulations and the 11 years of accepted truth, I found myself hoping, quietly, that Dane was right. The 48-hour clock had already started. None of us yet understood how much would change before it ran out. The first 3 hours after we left the wreckage were the longest of my career, and I have spent that career studying creatures most people would not want to be locked in a room with. My name is Ellen Marsh, and at the time I served as the ship's medical and xenobiology officer, which meant that whatever Dane brought aboard eventually became my responsibility to understand, whether I felt ready for it or not. Ash sat in the center of the medical bay, still wrapped in the thermal blanket, refusing to move, refusing to eat, refusing to make a single sound. I had read every file our small ship's database held on Threxil physiology, and every single one of them agreed on the same grim prediction. A cub separated from its pack this young would show extreme food refusal, followed by increasingly aggressive defensive behavior, followed, within days, by a complete behavioral collapse from which there was no recorded recovery. I did not tell Dane this directly. I did not need to. He had clearly already read the same files, sitting up half the night going through every scrap of information our system could pull. What worried me most was not the data itself, but how confidently it was written. Scientists who had never once succeeded in raising an unbonded Threxil had still managed to produce decades of confident predictions about exactly how such an attempt would fail. I found that strange, even before I understood how much of it might be wrong. On the second day, Ash finally ate, though only after Dane sat beside the enclosure for nearly 2 hours without speaking. I recorded everything: temperature, heart rate, the subtle chemical markers in the air that indicated stress hormone levels, because I wanted hard evidence either way. What I found surprised me enough that I checked my instruments twice before trusting the readings. Ash's stress hormones, though elevated far beyond anything I would consider healthy in a human child, were already lower than every recorded baseline I could find for a Threxil cub in captivity. Not slightly lower, significantly lower. I brought this to Dane immediately, half expecting him to dismiss it as simple luck. He did not dismiss it. He asked me one question instead, and it was a question that reframed everything I thought I understood about the species. "Every study you are reading," he said, "every single one, was conducted on cubs raised in cages by handlers who were afraid of them the entire time. Is there a single study anywhere in that database of a Threxil cub raised by someone who was not afraid?" I searched. I searched for the rest of that day, and the answer, uncomfortable as it was to admit, came back the same every time. There was not one, not a single documented case, across centuries of records, of a Threxil cub being raised by a caretaker who approached it without fear, restraint, or eventual violence. Every conclusion the scientific community had reached about the species' nature had been built entirely from observing how the species behaved when treated as a threat from the moment it was found. I want to be honest about how unsettling that realization was. I had trusted those studies. I had built years of professional judgment on top of them, and in the space of one conversation, I found myself wondering whether an entire field of science had mistaken the result of fear for the nature of a species. Over the following days, my job shifted from documenting a dangerous creature to documenting something closer to a very unusual, very cautious child. Ash tested every boundary on the ship, exactly as the old studies predicted it would. It broke a storage panel testing the strength of its claws. It refused to sleep unless it could see the door. It reacted to sudden movement with a defensive display sharp enough to make even seasoned crew members flinch. All of this matched the predictions. What did not match the predictions was what happened after each of these moments. When Ash broke the storage panel, Dane did not punish it, and he did not ignore it either. He simply repaired the panel with Ash watching, narrating each step out loud in a calm, ordinary voice, as though explaining a simple consequence to any curious child, rather than disciplining a dangerous animal. When Ash reacted defensively to sudden movement, the crew member involved, a quiet engineer named Noah Bright, did not retreat in fear or demand the creature be restrained. He apologized, in the plain way you apologize to a person you startled by accident, and went back to his work. I began to understand, slowly, that the humans aboard this ship were not managing a dangerous animal through careful containment. They were parenting, in the most literal and unglamorous sense of the word, a creature that had never once in its short life been given the chance to learn that not every reaction had to be a fight for survival. By the end of the first week, Ash allowed physical contact for the first time, a small thing by most standards, simply permitting Dane to check an injury on its foreleg, without pulling away or baring its teeth. I documented the moment with more excitement than I probably should have shown as a scientist, because I understood, watching it happen, that I was witnessing something no record in our database had ever described. Word of what we were doing had, of course, already begun to travel. Salvage crews talk, station officials talk, and a story as strange as ours does not stay quiet for long. Within 2 weeks, we received our first formal inquiry from a regional oversight office, requesting documentation of our continued custody of a live, unbonded Threxil cub, well beyond the standard 48-hour evaluation window most species allowed for such cases. Dane answered the inquiry honestly. He reported every behavioral marker, every incident, every measurement I had recorded, including the ones that looked concerning on paper. He did not hide the difficult moments, the broken panel, the defensive reactions, the nights Ash refused to sleep. What he added, at the end of his report, was a single observation that I helped him phrase carefully, because we both understood how unusual it would sound to anyone reading it. Every documented marker of instability in this cub has decreased steadily since removal from a fear-based environment. We are requesting continued evaluation time based on measurable improvement, not sentiment. The response we received back was cautious, non-committal, and, most importantly, did not order Ash's immediate termination. It granted an extended observation period, citing the unusual and, in their words, scientifically relevant nature of our data. I do not think the officials who approved that extension expected what would eventually come of it. I do not think any of us fully did. There was one night, about 3 weeks into our observation period, that I still think about often, because it changed how I understood not just Ash, but the entire premise behind the Cull Accord itself. We had hit a patch of turbulence passing through an unstable debris field, nothing serious, but enough to rattle the ship hard enough that half the crew was thrown from their bunks. Ash, startled awake by the sudden violent motion, reacted the way any frightened animal might, claws extended, quills raised, a defensive posture aimed at the nearest moving object, which happened to be Dane, rushing in to check on the commotion. For one terrible second, I believed we were about to witness exactly the outcome every study had warned us about. Dane did not retreat. He did not raise a weapon, or even raise his voice. He simply stopped moving entirely, lowered himself to the floor, and spoke in the same calm, ordinary tone he always used. "It is just turbulence," he said. "Nobody is hurt. You are safe." Ash did not immediately relax. For nearly a full minute, it remained coiled, ready to defend itself against a danger that no longer existed, but it did not attack. It watched Dane, breathing hard, until slowly, visibly, its quills lowered and its claws retracted. I recorded that moment more carefully than almost anything else during our time observing Ash, because it told me something the old studies never once considered. Every documented case of a Threxil turning violent under stress had occurred in an environment where violence was already the expected response, where handlers reacted to a startled cub with restraint, punishment, or fear of their own. Ash, in that moment, had every biological reason to attack, and did not, because it had never once been taught that attacking was the only available option. I brought this observation to Dane afterward, still shaken by how close that moment had felt, even though nothing had actually happened. He listened quietly, and then said something that has stayed with me since. Something I later understood was not just about Ash, but about an entire philosophy that would eventually put us all in the crossfire of a much larger argument. "We are not taming it," he said. "We are just not breaking it in the first place." By the end of the first month, Ash had grown noticeably, faster than any human child would, closer to the size of an adolescent, and stronger by the day. The danger it represented, physically, was undeniable, and I never once stopped documenting that danger honestly in my reports. But alongside that danger, for the first time in the recorded history of the species, was something else entirely. Trust. Slow, hard-won, imperfect trust. Built not through control, but through the simple, repeated choice not to be afraid. I did not yet know how much that choice would cost us. I only knew, watching Ash finally fall asleep peacefully for the first time since we found it, curled loosely near Dane's feet rather than pressed defensively into a corner, that whatever we were building on this ship was something the rest of the galaxy was not yet ready to understand. It would not stay quiet for much longer. The inquiries were only going to grow louder from here. My name is Solon Vey, and for most of my career I believed that peace across the galaxy depended on old laws being respected without question. I still believe peace matters more than almost anything else. What I no longer believe, and what I did not believe before that year, is that every old law was written for the reasons we were taught to think they were. I served as a senior diplomatic officer, stationed at a listening post along one of the busiest trade corridors in known space, the kind of posting where very little happens quickly, and almost nothing happens without paperwork first. My days were built from trade disputes, minor territorial disagreements, and the occasional request to mediate between species who disliked each other slightly more than they disliked doing the paperwork required to fight about it properly. I had grown comfortable in that slow, careful rhythm. Then a report crossed my desk that I initially assumed was some kind of clerical error. The report described a human vessel, small, independently registered, that had taken custody of an unbonded Threxil cub nearly 6 weeks earlier, and had not yet surrendered it for termination under the Cull Accord. Instead, the report described continued observation, ongoing behavioral data, and a formal request for extended custody based on measurable improvement in the cub's condition. I read that final phrase 3 times before I accepted that it was not a mistake in translation. I want to explain, for anyone unfamiliar with how deeply this law is woven into galactic culture, exactly what that report meant to the people who first read it. The Cull Accord is not treated as a controversial policy in most of civilized space. It is treated the way you might treat a law against releasing a known contagion into a crowded station. Nobody debates it at dinner. Nobody questions the reasoning behind it in polite company. It simply exists, quietly, as one of the oldest and most universally accepted agreements between species, built from centuries of painful, well-documented history. The history, briefly, is this. Long before most current governments existed, the Threxil were nearly hunted to collapse by other species who feared them, precisely because early attempts to raise unbonded cubs in captivity ended, again and again, in tragedy. Handlers were harmed. Entire settlements were evacuated. The species developed a reputation so severe that the eventual solution, brutal as it sounds, was framed by lawmakers of that era as the more merciful choice. Rather than allow an unbonded cub to grow into an uncontrollable threat, the Accord mandated swift, painless termination before that outcome could occur. For generations, this was simply accepted as a hard truth about a dangerous species, not a policy anyone needed to re-examine. I was assigned to investigate the human vessel personally, both to confirm the accuracy of the report and to determine whether formal intervention was required. My superiors were, understandably, concerned less with scientific curiosity and more with precedent. If one crew was permitted to ignore the Accord's standard evaluation window, other crews across other species might attempt the same, and the resulting chaos, they feared, would be measured in lives lost, rather than paperwork filed. I traveled to intercept the human vessel with a modest escort, prepared to invoke the Accord formally if necessary, but instructed to gather information first. I did not expect, walking aboard that ship, to have my own understanding of the galaxy quietly dismantled over the course of a single conversation. The crew met me without hostility, which surprised me less than what I found waiting in their common area. The cub, now closer to adolescent size, sat calmly near a human engineer working on a console, close enough to reach him easily, and did not react to my arrival with anything resembling the defensive aggression every file I had studied described as inevitable. It watched me. It assessed me, the way any intelligent creature assesses an unfamiliar presence. But it did not attack, and it did not retreat in panic either. I met with the human called Dane in a small briefing room, and I opened our conversation the way protocol required, informing him formally of the Accord, the danger it existed to prevent, and the legal authority I carried to enforce it, if evaluation determined termination was necessary. He listened respectfully, without interrupting, and then asked a question I had genuinely never been asked before in 11 years of diplomatic service. "Has anyone from your government actually reviewed this case individually?" he asked. "Or is my crew simply the first one who refused to let the outcome be assumed before it was examined?" I told him the truth, because diplomacy built on dishonesty rarely holds for long. I told him that Cull Accord cases were, by design, not meant to require individual review. The law assumed the outcome. That was the entire point of it existing, to remove the burden of deciding case by case whether a Threxil cub could be trusted, since history had already answered that question definitively, long before any of us were born. Dane did not argue the way I expected him to. He did not raise his voice, or accuse me of cruelty, or dismiss the history I had just described. Instead, he asked me to review the data his crew had collected, honestly, including the difficult incidents, before making any recommendation to my superiors. I agreed, mostly because refusing would have looked far worse in my own report than simply reviewing evidence I fully expected to confirm exactly what I already believed. I spent the better part of 2 days reviewing the medical officer's records, and I will admit, plainly, that what I found did not match my expectations. Every measurable marker of stress and instability had declined steadily since the cub's removal from its original environment. There were no incidents of unprovoked aggression. There was, instead, a slow, careful, well-documented pattern of a young creature learning, apparently for the first time in the species' recorded history, that violence was not the only available response to fear. I raised the obvious counter-argument, the one every scientist trained in Threxel behavior would raise immediately. A juvenile cub behaving calmly under controlled conditions proves very little about how a fully matured adult, physically capable of extreme harm, will behave once that maturity arrives. Dane agreed with me entirely, which I had not expected. "You are right to be cautious about the future," he said. "I am only asking that the caution be based on what actually happens, rather than on what we have always assumed will happen, because no one before us was willing to find out otherwise." I returned to my superiors with a report that satisfied almost no one, including myself. I could not, in good conscience, recommend immediate termination, based on evidence that directly contradicted the assumption the accord was built upon. I also could not, given the scale of history behind that law, recommend abandoning it entirely, based on a single case that had not yet been tested by the cub reaching full maturity. What I recommended instead was continued monitoring, formal and official, under joint oversight, allowing the case to proceed while treating it as exactly what it was, an unprecedented test of a law nobody had ever seriously questioned before. My recommendation was not popular. Several senior officials argued that any deviation from standard accord procedure set a dangerous precedent regardless of the outcome, since it implied that centuries of established law might have been built on incomplete understanding rather than settled fact. Others argued, more quietly, that if the humans were right, even partially, then every enforced termination carried out under the accord, until this point, represented a tragedy far larger than any incident the law had been designed to prevent. I did not sleep well during that period. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters to understanding what happened later. I had spent my entire career trusting that the oldest, most universally accepted laws in galactic society existed because they had been proven correct through hard experience. I had never once considered that a law could become self-confirming, that treating an entire species as inevitably dangerous might itself be the reason that danger so reliably appeared. News of the case spread faster than my superiors wanted it to, despite our efforts to keep the investigation quiet. Other species, curious and often skeptical, began requesting access to the same behavioral data I had reviewed. Scientific communities that had never seriously studied Threxel behavior outside of captivity-related trauma suddenly found themselves debating, in public forums, whether an entire species had been misunderstood for generations, due to nothing more than the conditions under which it had always been observed. I was ordered to continue monitoring the case personally, given my direct familiarity with it, which meant I would remain closely involved in whatever happened next, whether I wanted to be or not. Looking back, I think some part of me did want to be involved, even though admitting that felt uncomfortable at the time. I had spent my career enforcing agreements I never once questioned. For the first time, I found myself hoping, quietly and against my own careful instincts, that the humans were right, and that an old fear I had never examined too closely might finally be proven wrong. I did not yet know how much the coming months would test that hope, or how close we would come to losing everything over a law nobody in power was willing to admit might have been mistaken from the very beginning. By the 6th month, Ash was no longer small enough to sit comfortably in the corner of a supply crate. My name is Dane, and I want to be honest about something before I describe what happened during this part of our journey together. Raising Ash was never as calm as the official reports made it sound. Every measurement Ellen recorded was accurate, but numbers on a page do not capture what it actually felt like to stand in a room with a creature growing stronger, faster, and more capable of real harm with every passing week, while everyone around me kept asking, quietly or directly, whether I was certain I knew what I was doing. I was not always certain. I want that said plainly, because I think people sometimes assume this story is about confidence, when really it was about choosing, again and again, not to let fear make decisions for me. Ash had grown into something closer to an adolescent by Threxel standards, taller than most of my crew, strong enough that a single careless swipe of a claw could have ended someone's career, or worse. The physical danger was real, and I never once pretended otherwise, to Ellen, to Solin Vey, or to myself. What had changed, slowly, was how Ash responded to that danger existing inside itself. There was a night during that period I still think about more than almost any other, because it tested everything we had built up to that point, and it very nearly ended differently than it did. We had taken on a new crew member for a short supply run, a young woman named Grace who had never worked alongside Ash before, and had only heard the stories, most of them exaggerated, some of them frightening enough on their own without exaggeration. She was nervous from the moment she boarded, and I understood that nervousness completely. I had felt it myself once, a long time before, standing outside a welded cargo door with a commanding officer telling me exactly how badly this would end. Grace startled one evening, dropping a heavy equipment case in the corridor just as Ash rounded the corner behind her. The sound was sharp, sudden, and close enough to trigger every defensive instinct Ash still carried from the earliest, most frightened days of its life. I was 2 rooms away when I heard the noise, and by the time I reached the corridor, Ash had already risen to its full height, quills raised, claws extended, positioned directly between Grace and the sound that had startled it. Grace froze. I want to be honest that in that moment, for perhaps 2 full seconds, I froze as well, because everything I had read, everything the old studies had warned about for generations, seemed to be unfolding exactly as predicted. A threatened Threxel, cornered by sudden fear, with an unfamiliar and frightened person standing directly in its path. I did not run toward them. I did not shout a command, or reach for anything resembling a weapon. I walked forward slowly, the same way I had all those months earlier outside a welded cargo door, and I spoke in the same calm, even voice I had always used, because I understood, in that moment, that changing my approach now would undo everything we had built. Ash, I said, it is only a dropped case. Grace is not a threat. Nobody is in danger. Ash did not immediately relax. Its attention remained locked on Grace, muscles coiled, breathing sharp and controlled, in the way I had learned meant it was assessing rather than attacking. I stepped closer, positioning myself gently beside Ash rather than in front of it, close enough to be felt, not close enough to be seen as an obstacle to whatever action it still believed might be necessary. "Look at me," I said quietly. Not at her, at me. It took nearly 30 seconds, though it felt considerably longer, before Ash's quills began to lower. It turned its head toward me fully, some of the tension leaving its shoulders, and I placed a hand gently against its side, the same gesture I had used 100 times before during calmer moments, hoping the familiarity of it would matter more than the fear still working its way through its system. Grace was safe. Nothing happened to her beyond a frightening 30 seconds she would likely remember for the rest of her life. But what happened after that moment mattered more to me than the moment itself, because it revealed something about how differently Ash was learning to process fear compared to every historical account I had studied. Once fully calm, Ash did something none of the old records described. It approached Grace directly, lowered its head, and remained still, allowing her, entirely at her own pace, to decide whether she wanted to reach out or retreat. It was not asking for forgiveness exactly, because I do not think the concept applies the same way across species. It was, as best as I could interpret it, checking whether the fear it had caused had actually resulted in harm, and adjusting its own understanding accordingly. Grace, to her credit, eventually reached out and rested her hand briefly against Ash's shoulder, her own breathing still unsteady, but her fear visibly easing as she did. I do not think either of them fully trusted each other yet after that single moment, but something had shifted, the same way it had shifted for me months earlier outside that cargo hold, the recognition that fear, met without more fear, tends to lose most of its power. I documented the incident honestly in my report to Solon Vey, exactly as I had documented every previous difficult moment, because I understood by then that the entire foundation of our continued custody depended on complete transparency. I did not hide the danger. I did not minimize how close that night had come to a very different outcome. What I emphasized instead was what happened after the danger passed, because that, I had come to believe, was the actual measure of whether the old assumptions about this species were correct. There were other tests during this period, smaller ones, that mattered just as much even if they never appeared in any official record. Ash learning to control its strength around fragile equipment after breaking several pieces through simple carelessness rather than aggression. Ash learning, slowly, to recognize the difference between a raised voice born of frustration and a raised voice born of genuine danger, two things that had likely been indistinguishable to it during its earliest, most traumatic experiences. Ash learning, most importantly, that restraint itself could be a source of strength rather than weakness, a lesson I tried to reinforce every single day, because I understood that this lesson, more than any other, was the one the old Cullicord assumed no Threxel could ever learn. I want to address something directly here, because I think it matters to understanding why we kept going despite the risk. I was never naive about what Ash was capable of. I never once believed that simple kindness alone could erase the physical reality of raising a creature strong enough to cause serious harm. What I believed, and what the evidence continued to support, was that the danger itself was not fixed. It was not an unchangeable fact of the species' nature, the way the old laws assumed. It was a response, shaped by circumstance, capable of being shaped differently, given a different circumstance. By the end of that 6th month, Ash had grown large enough that strangers who saw it for the first time reacted with open alarm, exactly as the old fear predicted they would. What those strangers did not see, because they had no reason to look for it, was a creature that had learned, through repeated, careful experience, that the world did not have to be met with violence in order to survive in it. Solon Vey's continued oversight meant that every incident, good and bad, eventually made its way back to officials far more skeptical than he had become. I understood the risk in that. I understood that a single serious mistake, one moment where restraint failed and harm resulted, would end not just our case, but likely any future chance for another crew to attempt what we were attempting. I chose to continue anyway, not because I was certain nothing would ever go wrong, but because I had come to believe that the alternative, deciding in advance that nothing could ever go right, was its own kind of failure, a quieter one perhaps, but no less permanent for the creature it was decided about before it ever had the chance to prove otherwise. I did not know, standing in that corridor with Grace and Ash both breathing hard from a moment that could have ended so differently, that the hardest test of everything we had built was still ahead of us, and that it would not come from within our own crew, but from an empire that had finally decided it was time to see for itself whether an old law still deserved to stand. I had grown used to quiet, careful progress by the time the warning came through, and that is exactly why it frightened me as much as it did. My name is Ellen Marsh, and after nearly a year of documenting Ash's development, I had allowed myself to believe, cautiously, that the hardest part of this journey might already be behind us. I was wrong, and the moment I understood how wrong I was, came without any warning at all. We received the formal notice during a routine supply stop at a mid-sized trade station, delivered not through the usual careful channel Solon Vey had established with us, but through an official Imperial enforcement vessel that requested docking clearance under full Cullicord authority. I remember the exact words on the notice, because I read them 3 times before fully understanding what they meant. Immediate custody transfer requested. Extended evaluation period, revoked by higher authority. Compliance required within 1 standard hour. Dane read the notice beside me, without speaking for a long moment. Ash, now fully grown, larger than any adult on our crew, sat nearby in the common area, sensing immediately that something had shifted in the room, the way it always seemed to sense changes in tension, long before any of us said a word aloud. I want to explain what full Cullicord authority meant in practice, because it was different from the careful, individual oversight Solon Vey had maintained with us for months. Higher authority meant the case had been escalated beyond regional review, likely by officials uncomfortable with how much public attention our situation had begun attracting. It meant the original assumption behind the accord, the one Solon Vey himself had quietly begun to question, was being reasserted from above, by people who had never once reviewed our data personally, and had no interest in doing so now. Dane did not panic, though I could see the weight of the moment settle into him differently than any previous challenge had. He requested immediate contact with Solon Vey directly, using every diplomatic channel our small crew had access to, while the enforcement vessel outside continued its approach toward our position at the station. Solon Vey answered within minutes, and I could hear in his voice, even across a strained communication channel, that he had not expected this order any more than we had. He explained, quickly and carefully, that the decision had come from officials far above his own authority, Officials who viewed the growing public debate around our case as a threat to the Accord's legitimacy, regardless of the actual evidence involved. He told us plainly that he did not agree with the order, but that he currently lacked the authority to override it. I asked him directly what would happen if we refused to comply. His answer was honest, and it was the answer I had feared most. Refusal at this stage would be treated as a direct violation of interspecies law, he said. It would justify forced boarding, and it would end any chance of continued evaluation, for Ash or for any future case like it. Dane made his decision quickly, though I could tell it cost him something significant to make it. He ordered our ship to remain docked, unarmed, and fully compliant with the approaching enforcement vessel, rather than attempt to flee or resist. I asked him why, given everything we had built, he was choosing to simply allow this confrontation to happen, rather than fight it. Because running proves their fear was justified, he said, and fighting proves it twice. The Imperial enforcement team boarded within the hour, led by an officer I did not recognize, armored heavily, weapons drawn in a full defensive formation, clearly designed for handling exactly the kind of dangerous creature the old records described. I remember watching Ash's reaction as they entered our common area, expecting, honestly, that this might be the moment every warning about its nature finally proved correct. Ash rose to its feet as the armored team spread into the room, and for one terrible moment, I believed we were about to witness the very outcome the Cull Accord had always predicted. Its posture shifted, alert, powerful, undeniably capable of serious harm against a room full of armed strangers who had entered without warning. Then Ash did something none of the enforcement team appeared prepared for. It moved directly beside Dane, positioning itself close, mirroring his posture rather than adopting an aggressive stance of its own. It did not bare its teeth. It did not raise its claws toward the armed strangers surrounding it. It simply stood, calm, watchful, and entirely, deliberately still. The lead enforcement officer hesitated, visibly uncertain how to proceed against a Threxel that was not behaving even remotely like the threat his training had prepared him for. I watched confusion spread across the faces of the armored team, the same confusion I remembered feeling myself, months earlier, the first time I had recorded Ash's stress hormones dropping, instead of rising, during a moment of danger. Dane spoke calmly into the tense silence, addressing the lead officer directly. "We are fully compliant with your custody order," he said. "I am only asking that you observe, honestly, what is actually happening in this room before you carry it out." The officer did not lower his weapon immediately, but he did pause long enough to allow Solon Vey, who had arrived personally aboard the same vessel, to step forward and address the situation directly. I could see, even from where I stood, that Solon Vey was struggling with something far more complicated than simple procedure. He had reviewed our data for months. He had watched this case unfold from skepticism to something closer to reluctant belief, and now he stood in a room where the very outcome he had come to expect was unfolding in front of armed officers trained to expect the opposite. Solon Vey requested, formally and on the record, that the custody transfer be delayed, pending direct observation of the Cub's actual behavior under stress, rather than proceeding purely on standing legal authority. It was a request that placed his own career at considerable risk, and I understood, watching him make it, exactly how much this case had changed him since the day he first boarded our ship. The enforcement officer, uncertain and clearly unprepared for the scene in front of him, agreed to a brief delay while the situation was reviewed further. It was not a resolution. It was, at best, a pause, one that could still end with Ash being taken from us the moment higher authority insisted the delay had gone on long enough. During that pause, something happened that none of the official reports could have predicted, and that none of us fully understood until much later how significant it truly was. Word of the standoff, recorded and shared by station witnesses who had gathered near the docking bay, spread rapidly through public channels far beyond our small ship. Other species, other stations, other observers who had followed our case from a distance for months began responding immediately, publicly, questioning openly why an order clearly contradicted by direct observation was being enforced regardless. I do not think the officials who issued the original order expected this level of public attention. I do not think they expected a Threxil, fully grown and undeniably capable of harm, to stand calmly beside a human, in the middle of an armed confrontation, and choose, deliberately, not to become the threat everyone in that room had been trained since childhood to fear. Solon Vey used that growing attention carefully, requesting, through every official channel available to him, an emergency review of the case before any final custody decision was carried out. It was not a guarantee of safety. Higher authority could still overrule him, could still insist the order be carried out regardless of public reaction or documented evidence. But for the first time since the enforcement vessel had first appeared on our scanners, I allowed myself to believe that we might survive this moment without losing everything we had spent a year building. Ash remained beside Dane throughout the entire standoff, calm, controlled, and entirely aware, I believed, of exactly how much depended on that calm holding steady. I do not know if Ash understood, in any way similar to how we understood it, the full weight of what was happening in that room. I only know that it chose, in the most dangerous moment of its life, not to become the monster an entire galaxy had already decided it must be. That choice, more than any report Solon Vey or I had ever filed, was about to change how the rest of the galaxy understood the species it had feared for centuries. I returned to the Imperial Court sooner than I expected, and I returned as a very different officer than the one who had first been sent to investigate a strange report about a human ship refusing to surrender a dangerous cub. My name is Solon Vey, and I want to describe honestly what happened once the standoff at that trade station became public knowledge, because the weeks that followed changed far more than a single case ever could have on its own. The recordings from that docking bay spread faster than any official statement could control. Within days, nearly every major information network across civilized space had access to footage of a fully grown Threxil, standing calm and controlled beside a human, refusing to become the threat an armed enforcement team had been trained to expect. I watched those recordings played again and again across different networks, each one framing the moment slightly differently, but none of them able to escape the same basic, uncomfortable truth. The old certainty had been wrong, or at the very least, it had never been as certain as centuries of unquestioned law had claimed. I was summoned before a full review council shortly after returning, expected to explain my decision to delay the custody transfer rather than simply enforce the order I had been given. I answered honestly, because I had grown tired, somewhere over the past year, of answering any other way. I explained the data I had personally reviewed, the steady decline in every measurable marker of instability, the repeated moments where danger had been present and had not resulted in harm. I explained, as carefully as I could, that the Cull Accord had never actually been tested against a case where a Threxil cub was raised without fear from the very beginning, because no one, in the entire recorded history of the law, had ever attempted it before. The reaction in that chamber was not unified, and I think that surprised me more than open hostility would have. Some officials responded with genuine curiosity, requesting access to every piece of data Ellen Marsh had recorded, eager to understand whether decades of assumed science needed serious revision. Others responded with something closer to quiet alarm, not because they doubted the evidence, but because they understood exactly what it implied about every previous case the Accord had already resolved through termination. I want to describe one exchange from that hearing specifically, because it captured, more than any other moment, the deeper fear driving the resistance to this case. An older council member, a respected voice in matters of interspecies law, asked me directly whether I understood what I was suggesting, if the evidence from this single case was taken seriously. I told him I believed I did understand, and he asked me to say it plainly, in front of the full council, rather than allow the implication to remain unspoken. I said it. I told the council that if this case proved what the evidence increasingly suggested, then the instability the Cull Accord had spent centuries treating as an unchangeable fact of Threxil nature may have been, in large part, a consequence of the very law meant to prevent it. Every cub terminated before maturity had been terminated based on an assumption never actually tested against an alternative. If that assumption was wrong, then the tragedy the Accord existed to prevent may have been caused, repeatedly, by the Accord itself. The chamber went very quiet after I said that, and I understood why. It is one thing to discover that a scientific assumption requires updating. It is an entirely different thing to accept that an entire civilization's most trusted law may have been responsible for generations of unnecessary loss, carried out in the name of safety, based on evidence that was never truly evidence at all, only fear repeating itself until it became indistinguishable from fact. Not everyone in that chamber was willing to accept that possibility easily, and I do not think that reaction was purely dishonest or self-serving. Some officials had built entire careers enforcing the accord as written, believing sincerely that they were preventing tragedy rather than causing it. Accepting this case as valid meant accepting a painful reckoning with decisions made in good faith that may have caused exactly the harm they were meant to prevent. I understood that resistance, even as I disagreed with where it was leading. The debate that followed lasted considerably longer than the original hearing, stretching across weeks rather than days, as more data was requested, more experts were consulted, and more officials from other regions weighed in, with opinions ranging from cautious support to firm opposition. Throughout all of it, public attention continued to grow, fueled by recordings of the standoff, by growing interest from independent scientists, eager to study a case that directly challenged decades of assumed understanding, and by a slowly shifting public sentiment that had begun to question, openly, whether the old fear surrounding this species had ever been entirely fair. I met privately with Dane and Ellen Marsh during this period, when official channels allowed it, and I told them honestly how uncertain the outcome remained. Dane listened without visible frustration, though I suspected the strain of waiting weighed on him more than he allowed himself to show. When I asked him how he remained so steady through months of uncertainty that could still end with Ash's termination, regardless of everything already proven, his answer was simple enough that it has stayed with me since. "I am not trying to win an argument," he said. "I am trying to give one creature the chance every other creature is given automatically, the chance to be judged by what it actually does, rather than what it is assumed to be before it does anything at all." The final review council session was, by far, the most tense gathering I had ever attended in my career. Every relevant piece of evidence was presented formally, including data from independent researchers who had, by that point, begun studying similar cases involving other historically feared species, raised under different conditions than assumed necessary. The pattern, though still early in its research, was beginning to suggest something far larger than a single unusual case, involving one unusually patient human crew. The Council's final decision was not the sweeping reversal some had hoped for, nor was it the strict enforcement others had demanded. It was, instead, a careful, deliberately cautious compromise, the kind institutions reach when they are not yet ready to fully admit fault, but can no longer ignore evidence directly contradicting their previous certainty. The Cull Accord would remain law, but a formal exception process would be established, allowing verified caretakers to pursue continued custody under strict, ongoing evaluation, rather than facing automatic termination the moment a cub was found separated from its pack. It was not everything Dane had hoped for. It was not, I suspect, everything I had quietly begun hoping for either, somewhere over the course of that long year. But it was enough. It was the first crack in a law that had stood, entirely unquestioned, for longer than most civilizations in the galaxy had existed. I left that final hearing carrying something I had not expected to carry when I first boarded a strange human ship, to investigate a report I assumed would end quickly and predictably. I carried the uncomfortable, necessary understanding that the oldest fears are not always the wisest ones, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is question a truth everyone around them has already stopped examining. The Empire, cautiously, had begun to change. It would take far longer than a single ruling for that change to be fully understood or accepted, but it had begun, and nothing that follows in this story would have been possible without that single, uncertain crack finally being allowed to open. I do not remember my earliest days with the clarity most creatures take for granted. I remember cold and hunger, and the particular kind of silence that comes from being alone in a place built to hold something dangerous. I remember a welded door, and the smell of fear that had settled into metal long before I arrived, to add my own fear to it. My name, given to me later by someone who never once raised a hand against me in anger, is Ash, and this is the part of the story only I can tell properly, because it happened inside me, in ways no outside record could ever fully capture. I do not know exactly when I stopped expecting every sound to mean danger. It did not happen suddenly, the way stories sometimes make it sound. It happened slowly, across 100 small moments, most of which probably seemed unremarkable to anyone watching from the outside. a meal left within reach without demand, a voice that stayed calm, even when I did not deserve calm in return, a hand that remained steady, even when every instinct in my body expected it to strike. I understand now, in ways I could not understand as a frightened cub, exactly how unusual my early life became, compared to every other member of my species who came before me. I have since met others like myself, cubs found the same way I was found, raised the same way I was raised, by caretakers, willing to risk their own safety on the simple, patient belief that fear did not have to be met with more fear. Watching them grow, calm and unafraid in ways the old records insisted was impossible, has been one of the strangest and most meaningful experiences of my life. The Empire still speaks of my case carefully, even now. I have heard the murmurs myself, in council chambers, on trade stations, among species who still remember, vividly, centuries of history that taught them to fear anyone like me on sight. Some of those murmurs are filled with genuine hope, a cautious optimism that an old mistake might finally be corrected. Others are filled with something closer to shame, the uncomfortable recognition that generations of loss may have been caused not by nature, but by assumption. I have learned to sit with both kinds of murmurs without letting either one define how I choose to live. I serve now, alongside Dane and Ellen Marsh, in a role that did not exist before my case forced the Empire to consider it seriously. I stand beside human diplomats during negotiations with species who still carry old fears about creatures like me, not as a weapon, and not as a symbol meant to prove a point, but simply as myself, calm, present, and entirely capable of choosing restraint, even when provoked. I have found that this choice, made visibly and repeatedly, does more to change old fear than any argument ever could. There was a negotiation not long ago that reminded me exactly how far the murmurs still had to travel before they became something closer to understanding. A delegation from a species with a long, painful history involving my own arrived deeply uncertain about sharing a room with me at all, despite years of data confirming everything Ellen Marsh had first documented aboard that small ship so long ago. I understood their fear. I did not resent it. I have learned, slowly, that fear built from real history deserves patience, even when that fear is aimed at me personally. I remained quiet throughout most of that negotiation, present but unobtrusive, allowing Dane to lead the conversation the way he always had, calm and steady, regardless of how the room around him reacted. Near the end of the meeting, one of the delegation's youngest members, clearly still uncertain despite everything discussed, asked me directly why I had never once, in any recorded account, chosen violence, when every old story insisted violence was inevitable for someone like me. I answered honestly, the same way Dane had always answered difficult questions during my own upbringing, because someone chose to believe I did not have to, before I ever had the chance to prove it either way. And once given that chance, I found I preferred proving it correct. The delegation left that negotiation still cautious, though visibly less afraid than when they had arrived. I do not expect fear built from centuries of history to disappear in a single meeting. I have learned, through my own long journey, that change of this kind moves slowly, built one careful choice at a time, rather than through any single dramatic moment, however meaningful that moment might feel while it is happening. I think often about the cargo hold where I was found, and about the version of myself that might have existed had that ship never been intercepted, had that welded door never been cut open, had a human named Dane decided, like everyone before him, that the old fear was simply too dangerous to question. I do not know that version of myself. I am grateful, more than I have adequate words to express, that I never had to become him. The Empire still murmurs about my case, in classrooms now as often as in council chambers, in scientific papers that continue re-examining assumptions once treated as unquestionable fact, in quiet conversations between species slowly, carefully reconsidering fears passed down across countless generations without ever once being tested against a genuine alternative. Some of those murmurs still carry doubt. Some still carry old fear that may never fully disappear, and I have made peace with that reality, because I understand it comes from real history, not simple ignorance. But increasingly, the murmurs carry something else as well, something that did not exist in any record before a small, unremarkable rescue vessel refused to let an old law decide my fate, before I had ever been given the chance to decide it myself. They carry the quiet, growing recognition that the most dangerous stories a civilization tells itself are not always the ones about monsters lurking at the edges of known space. Sometimes, the most dangerous stories are the ones a civilization repeats about itself, certain enough in their own truth that no one ever thinks to ask whether they were true to begin with. I stand now, grown, capable of great harm should I ever choose it, and I choose, every single day, not to. Not because I am incapable of the violence an entire galaxy once assumed was my only nature, but because someone, once, chose to sit quietly outside a locked door and wait, unafraid, for me to discover a different nature, waiting underneath the fear I had been taught to expect from everyone I ever met. The Empire still murmurs about what happened aboard that small human ship, all those years ago. I have stopped being troubled by those murmurs. I have started, instead, to hope that somewhere among them, another frightened cub, found the same way I was found, might one day hear a version of my story and discover, long before I ever had the chance to, that the fear does not have to win. That hope, more than anything else I carry from my long and difficult beginning, is the truest measure of everything Dane and Ellen Marsh, and even Solon Vey in his own careful way, gave to me when they chose, against every old certainty surrounding them, to believe that I could become something other than what the galaxy had already decided I must be.